This video covers Learning Objective 1.3 for PSY 235 Social Psychology as part of Chapter 1. To continue what I was talking about in the last video, it should be clear by now that people tend to, A, want to feel good about themselves, and B, want to feel like they understand how the world and the people in it work. So in this section of the chapter, we're going to look at two basic human motivations. The first being the need to feel good about ourselves, and the second being the need to feel like we can accurately explain to ourselves what's happening, what's going on. So let's go over these two basic motives in human experience. Before we talk about the two motives separately, understand that any situation has both subjective and objective elements, and every person within that situation has their own unique sort of set of subjective and objective influences. So we're impacted by both our subjective understandings and the objective qualities of what we're seeing and experiencing. Our challenge as human beings is to kind of figure out how and why people come to the conclusions that they come to when they're in that social world. So why did the crowd stampede when they heard one child scream at the Beyonce concert? What was it in their objective appraisal of the situation? What was it in their own subjective experiences that encouraged them to panic? So, that's really what social psychologists do, is to try and figure out, why do people interpret the world the way that they do? So there are these two basic human motives. The first motive is human beings as social creatures. Most of us care a great deal about how we feel about ourselves. This is often referred to as the self-esteem approach, because a lot of our perceptions of ourselves, our perceptions of others, kind of wrap around to relating to how we feel about ourselves. So, how you perform on a quiz or a test, for example, reflects on you. If you do very well, it makes you feel good. If you do very poorly, it makes you feel bad sometimes. And then if you compare your score or your performance to another person that let's say that person does better than you, how does that make you feel? That person does worse than you, how does that make you feel? I'm sure you can identify with those sorts of thoughts. So one of the basic human motives that drives our social lives and our responses to social influence is the need to feel good about ourselves. The second is, it's often called the social cognitive approach, and I phrase this just slightly differently than your authors do. It's the need to feel like you are accurate. It's not the need to actually 100% be accurate, because to 100% be accurate, you would have to expend an infinite amount of mental energy collecting data to make a judgment about what the world is actually like. We don't have time for that. We do not have the capacity, cognitively or otherwise, to do that kind of investigation. At the same time, though, we don't want to feel like we don't have a clue what's going on. So this need to feel accurate is actually a real powerful motive. It underlies why we just so immediately try to interpret why other people do what they do. And then we commit. We commit to our interpretation of their behavior. To dig a little deeper into the self-esteem approach, or this drive to feel good about ourselves, we need to start with defining what self-esteem is, because most people have a really strong need to feel reasonably good about themselves. Self-esteem, the technical definition, how it's usually used by psychologists, is your own subjective perception of your own self-worth. Like, how good do you feel about who you are and what you do? So it's the extent to which you see yourself as good and competent and decent and kind. those sorts of variables. In our cultural context, those are the things: being good, competent, decent, kind. Those are values that we share culturally. So there might be slight differences from one culture to the next about what these concepts are that make up self-esteem. But in the Western world, it tends to be this cluster of good, competent, decent, kind, things like that. When we are faced with having done something that challenges that, like say you cheat on your partner, I'm sure that executive after the Coldplay concert is like, I need an explanation. Well, what did happen in his first announcement? So if you missed my previous video with the Coldplay incident, basically had this man who's a tech executive of some sort, and he goes to a Coldplay concert with one of the members of his staff, his actual HR director, who is not his wife, and he is not her husband. And they are caught on the kiss cam embracing during the concert, and the lead singer of Coldplay calls them out and says, because they immediately hide their faces. And he says, basically, either you're having an affair or you're very, very shy. So what happens when this gets posted on TikTok? Because it was. The guy in this scenario, he posts a social media post immediately saying that he should have had a right to privacy. That, going on these cameras, people should be asked first. They shouldn't be called out, and they were having a private moment. So it's basically deflecting away from the fact that he's cheating on his wife with his employee. Instead, it's the fault of the concert managers, and they shouldn't be doing that. So that's a very clear example of a person trying to defend their self-esteem, their perception of themselves as decent, competent people. If we're given a choice, and there's decades and decades of research to show that this is the case, if we're given a choice between kind of distorting the way we perceive the world in order to continue feeling good about ourselves, we're going to go with that, even if it distorts the reality. So this guy saying he should have a right to privacy in an arena that's a highly public event at a concert and people carry phones all the time, and kiss cam is hilarious, you shouldn't really expect privacy. That kind of context, because it's inherently not private. But that is his distortion of the world, and the goal of distorting his perception of the world is so that he can still continue to see himself as a competent, decent human being, which he probably isn't. Anyway, this tendency toward preserving self-esteem tends to lead to something called the self-serving bias. And I give you this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where Calvin says to his dad, "I've concluded that nothing bad I do is my fault." And his dad says, "Oh." And Calvin says, "Right, being young and impressionable, I'm the helpless victim of countless bad influences and unwholesome culture panders to my undeveloped values and pushes me to maleficence. I take no responsibility for my behavior. I'm an innocent pawn. It's society's fault." And Dad says, "Then you need to build more character. Go shovel a walk." And Calvin grouses, "These discussions never go where they're supposed to." This is funny because it's kind of the self-serving way in which we try on a very frequent basis to deflect. So if you acted in a way that in retrospect is embarrassing or hurtful to another person, you say the wrong thing and you hurt someone's feelings, we are routinely kind of our gut level reaction is, well, I did it for a reason, or they did this, and therefore my response is completely justified. That's referred to as the self-serving bias. So we tend to make interpretations of things around us that actually bolster or at least maintain our self-esteem. part of what's happening here is the idea of justifying our past behavior. So when we engage in an activity, and if there's some question as to the appropriateness of that activity, so was it not kind? Was it kind of stupid? And so on, then we have a tendency to justify our past behavior. So one of my favorite comic strips is Doug Savage's Savage Chickens. And the one chicken here says, "You've got a problem with avoiding personal accountability." And the other chicken says, "Yeah, and whose fault is that?" Basically implying that it's the first chicken's fault, or someone else's. That is a tendency that human beings have. So, think about a time when you've done something, particularly stupid or just insensitive to another person. Acknowledging, even for a moment, that we're stupid or incompetent or unkind is really, really uncomfortable for us. So acknowledging major deficiencies, as your authors put it, is not something we feel good about doing because it challenges our sense of ourselves as good, decent, and kind and competent. So we're going to distort what happened. So let's say you get into a fender bender on the highway and you're pulled off to the side of the road and you're being questioned by the highway patrol, and they're asking you what happened. Likely your spin is going to take away some of the responsibility from you and put it outside of you. Like other drivers were driving too close to you, or that person did X, Y, or Z behavior and it caused you to bang into them. That's a pretty typical example of the way we justify past behavior. Other examples, like what they give you in the class or in the textbook, they talk about how a couple gets divorced after being married a long time, and in this case, one of the marital partners is irrationally jealous. Instead of admitting that jealousy and overpossessiveness and working on not being that way, the breakup happens. Afterwards, this person then blames the breakup on the fact that the partner wasn't responsive enough to their needs to make the marriage work. So deflecting blame onto other people is pretty typical of how we kind of respond to our own unpleasant behaviors. Now, regular everyday people, because generally this is adaptive behavior. Now, that may surprise you to hear me say that. Normal, healthy, adapted people can kind of put a spin on things that makes them feel a little better, gives them the best possible light on what they've done. So, you break a rule or something. Like I know someone who their workplace has strict dress code expectations for their employees, and the person decided to intentionally break that dress code, and they got into trouble for it. After the fact, when telling the story, the person really highlighted the fact that they chose to break the rule for a good, valid, smart reason, to make a point, for example, that needed making, even if it was just to challenge the rules. So they're putting a positive spin on a negative behavior to make themselves feel better. Now, another example that you're given in the text is the impact of hazing on people. So when we join certain social groups, there are sometimes initiation experiences that we go through. Like when I was a track athlete in high school 100,000 years ago, there was this tradition that all of the first year, the freshmen on the track team, you got your shoes stolen and your shoes got rubbed in the mud. And if there wasn't mud handily available, mud would be made and your shoes would be trashed. This was a hazing experience. You would get tackled, your shoes ripped off by the upperclassmen, and they would be made filthy, and then you'd be handed your shoes back, and you had to run your first practice in wet, muddy shoes. That's a hazing experience. You can probably think of other classic examples of hazing, that some of which can have really dramatically negative consequences. What we find in social psychology is that if you go through a really negative experience to become a part of a group, that causes this disconnect. So why am I letting myself be tortured? Why did I let my brand new shoes get trashed by these other people? In order to continue feeling competent and smart, we have to justify that past behavior. So you're going to say to yourself, it's really important that I be a good member of this team, that I be accepted by the team. So I'm going to put up with their abuse because it wasn't just dirty shoes. The hazing of the freshmen track athletes went on for the entire first year. And then some of us happily engaged in the same behavior going forward until parents put their feet down and said, shoes are expensive. Stop doing that. But anyway, the end result is you care more about that organization. You like that organization more because of the hazing. It's sort of a twisted psychological experience that encourages people to put a positive spin even on their suffering. So to review here, the more unpleasant the process is for getting people into a group, the more they tend to like it. Groups have to go really, really far in order for people to interpret hazing as a step too far. Especially if it's a group that they identify with and they really value it and they want to be in it, then they tend to be motivated in order to maintain the positive picture of themselves, mostly about being competent and smart. Because if you're a smart person, would you actually let yourself be hazed? I had a friend who joined a fraternity when we were in college, and I remember seeing him at the study tables, and he was disgusting. He smelled bad. His hair was greasy, and I was like, Greg, what is the matter? Are you sick? And he said, no, I'm not sick. I'm not allowed to shower. I'm like, why aren't you allowed to shower? He said, because I'm rushing a fraternity and I'm not allowed to shower. It was part of the humiliation of Pledge Week, where they weren't allowed to shower. They had to do whatever the senior brothers said for them to do, all kinds of just ridiculous tasks. But mostly they had to stink for a week in public, in class, and have their brothers, their soon-to-be brothers, point that out all over campus. So I knew Greg. Greg was super smart. So to be smart, he said, this is going to be such a powerful networking opportunity for me as I go forward with my schooling. So that was his justification. Getting into this fraternity was a way of making friends, but also networking with potential contacts for his future. And, from my point of view, I'm like, why are you buying friends and engaging in such a humiliating behavior of walking around without showering? I mean, he was a student athlete too, so he was sweating like crazy every day at practice, and he wasn't allowed to shower. So from an outsider's perspective, that's just loopy behavior. But for him, it was justified by outcomes down the road and the importance of the organization to him. Now, in contrast to the self-esteem approach, you have this often contradictory need to feel like you understand what's going on. And this is called the social cognition perspective, where you're considering the way people think about the world, how they construe it, how they make sense of it. Social cognition, just to give you an understanding of what that concept is, it's how people think about themselves in their social context. So you're selecting information, you're interpreting information, you're choosing what to remember and not remember, and you're going to use that social information to make decisions about what to do. So the idea is that people like to feel like they're smart enough to accurately judge what's happening, so that they feel confident in the decisions that they make. Now, sometimes this idea of being accurate in your judgments clashes with your need to maintain high self-esteem. And we'll talk about that disconnect pretty often as we move through the semester, so pay attention to that. People typically, though, unless they're like a super detective, people generally make a very quick appraisal of what's going on around them and feel overconfident that they know that they have interpreted the situation properly. Social cognition perspective says, we tend to see ourselves as amateur detectives, and we're doing our best to make sense of the social world. And we tend to be irrationally confident that we know what's going on. Now, these two needs do tend to conflict at times, and that's one of the really interesting facets of being a social creature is, on the cognitive side, we make decisions that we think make sense. On the emotional side, we need it to make sense, but only in a way that makes us feel good about ourselves. So in order to perceive the world accurately, you may have to admit that you did something stupid or foolish or immoral, that you made a mistake. And it in fact wasn't somebody else's fault. You just did something wrong, or you performed poorly, whatever. More often than not, the need for self-esteem is stronger than the need to be accurate. And that's an important consideration that's going to keep coming up as we move through this semester. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 1.3.